The U.S. president raises the stakes in his trade dispute with China. He's also threatening to take aim at Europe. It may be just a negotiating position, but it also raises the question, is the global consensus around free trade coming to an end? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Daddy Abugaida. For decades, there has been a broad international consensus. Free trade is good, protectionism is bad. Well, closed markets make nations poorer, and the free flow of goods across borders ultimately benefits everyone. But now, that idea is being challenged from an unexpected corner. The U.S. has always been the world's biggest champion of free trade, but Donald Trump is threatening allies and rivals alike with duties and tariffs. His main target so far has been China, but on Thursday he made it clear he doesn't see China as the only problem.
In many respects, I think we're going to have a fantastic relationship long-term with China, but we have to get this straightened out. We have to have some balance. And that goes for other countries, and it goes for other places. If you look at the European Union, it's very solidly against us in terms of trade. It's very unfair. Look at a young girl shaking her head. Yes, you know about the European Union? It's like, it's almost, we can't even do business. They send their cars over here. They send everything over here. They don't want to take our product. So we can't let that happen.
Well, now China, hardly the world's most open country when it comes to trade, finds itself a vocal defender of free trade and globalization.
If they insist on unilateralism and trade protectionism against the wishes of China and the international community, we will fight to the death at any cost. We will resolutely fight back and take new measures and protect the interests of our country and the people.
Well, Trump set off the current trade tensions when he imposed wide-ranging duties on steel and aluminum. They didn't specifically target China, but they still provoked a response. Beijing announced tariffs covering $3 billion worth of U.S. imports. These were focused on agricultural products, including pork, wine, and fish. The U.S. upped the ante, this time slapping levies on China's tech and industrial sectors. These affect goods worth $50 billion. China responded in kind, outlining tariffs on $50 billion of American goods, including soybeans, cars, and chemical products. And now, Washington is mulling duties on another $100 billion of Chinese imports. Well, it's worth noting that only the steel and aluminum tariffs are in effect so far, leaving a window for negotiation over the rest. On the panel today, I'm joined from Singapore by Deborah Elms. She's the executive director at the Asian Trade Center. In Hong Kong, Andrew Leung, an international China strategist. And in Birmingham, that's in the UK, Scott Lucas is joining us. He's a professor of international politics at the University of Birmingham. Welcome to you all. Deborah Elms, Trump is saying that we've already lost the trade war. We don't have a trade war with China. If it's not a trade war, what is it?
Well, that's a good question. I think we're at the beginning of a trade war. I don't think we're quite in the middle of what could be a full-blown trade war, although we haven't really had one. So it's kind of hard to define what one would look like. But if you were in the middle of one, I think this is what it starts to look like, this escalation, counter-escalation, threat, retaliation, etc. So if we're not in one, we are perilously close to being in one.
Here's the thing, though, Deborah. The U.S. is allowing 60 days for feedback, and it hasn't really specified when the tariffs would take effect. So effectively, some people saying Trump is leaving a window open for talks. Is that what he's doing here? Is he leaving some sort of room for negotiations?
Possibly. The window is actually shorter than that. There's a 30-day comment period here, and the entire process by the U.S. side has been held under something called Section 301, under which the United States, although of course it's a unilateral decision by the U.S., but under which the United States has effectively 1 calendar year or so to make a determination, and that brings us to about August 10th, August 11th. That is remarkably short for the kind of complex negotiations that would have to take place, especially when the two parties really haven't yet begun the discussions. So I think that while we might be able to resolve these kinds of issues, whatever those issues happen to be, and that's a separate issue I'm sure we'll get to in a minute, the time is not that long for a very intensive set of negotiations that have to unfold.
Andrew Leung, Chinese state media is saying that Beijing has many more weapons in its arsenal to deploy against the U.S. in the event of a trade war. What sort of retaliation can we expect from China?
Well, if we look at these tariffs, in fact, this is only constitute only a small part of China's export to the United States, because nowadays, as China's economy is weaning itself away from too much dependence on exports. So it is the economy is shifting towards internal consumption, shifting towards services. Whereas if you look at on the American side, for example, these retaliatory tariffs from China account for a sizable proportion of America's export to China. For example, soybeans and also cars, China being the biggest customer. So that's point number one. China is targeting at those big ticket items, particularly those items which hurt President Trump's constituency. Secondly, there are, of course, other weapons. For example, China, of course, has a deficit in terms of trade in services. Now, this Trump administration's rhetoric about the huge trade deficit, of course, the trade only refers to trade in goods, but it completely ignores the tremendous trade surplus America enjoys in trade in services with China. So China can also retaliate on services. And thirdly, of course, is the nuclear option, which of course would hurt China as well. Which is, of course, China is a huge investor in U.S. Treasuries. So by buying less U.S. Treasuries, it's going to push up the U.S. interest rates and will hurt the U.S. economy. But of course, in turn, it will hurt China.
Okay, so seeing
Beijing,
as it will hurt China as well, then how willing is Beijing to come to the table and find some sort of deal, or possibly give in to the U.S. and give the U.S. some sort of concessions, which then Trump can say, well, here are the concessions that we've gotten from China, and that's a win for him? Well,
I think that the other problem, of course, is there are genuine grievances on the part of the United States, apart from a deficit. China is perceived to use measures which force American companies in China to share their intellectual property. And of course, there are accusations of outright intellectual property theft. So I think that these are genuine grievances by American companies operating in China. And somehow China has got to address that. But just focusing on the imbalance, again, ignores the fact that there is both in trade and services as well, where the United States enjoys a huge surplus.
Scott Lucas, in your opinion, what is the president's justification in doing all of this? Is it strictly over the issue of intellectual property? Is it over national security, which we've heard that argument being thrown about as well? This is all about national security. Do you buy that? And what problem are these tariffs really supposed to address?
Well, if you assume a coherence here, there is an issue, as we've heard, over intellectual property and the supposed theft of it by China. That has been a long-standing issue. But this has not been a coherent process. We need to realize the politics behind this, and that is the United States initially tried to impose steel and aluminum tariffs at the start of March. But instead of directing them at China, because China doesn't export much steel to the United States, it hit American allies, Canada, Brazil, Germany, South Korea, Japan. So at the end of March, the United States was forced effectively to pull back those steel and aluminum tariffs. On the same day that they pulled back those tariffs, they then made the announcement which said, okay, now we're going to aim at China by imposing the duties on 60 billion of goods. So in other words, it was partly because of the misfire over the impulsive imposition of the steel and aluminum tariffs that they took this political, not economic, but political decision. Now the second problem, the second factor is that very quick decision at the end of March has actually divided the White House. We know about Donald Trump. We know he said loudly yesterday, I will impose duties on more Chinese products. We know that he has hard-right advisors like Stephen Miller, who is goading him into this. But there are other advisors, including his new economic head, Larry Kudlow, who actually think that tariffs are not the way to go with this. And that's why this window that you've talked about, whether it's 30 days, whether it's 60 days, whether it's until August, means that not only is there the negotiation between the U.S. and China, I think you're going to see a negotiation within the White House about how far they actually go with this.
Could this backfire on Trump in a way, Scott? I know you're speaking to us from Birmingham, but a lot of the products that China decided to impose tariffs on, like soybeans, like corn, like pork, for example, they seem to be hitting a lot of the states in which Trump won in. So could this plan backfire?
Absolutely. I mean, I've got an uncle who's a farmer. And already you've got farmers in those core states that you're talking about in the Midwest, many of them that decided the election for Donald Trump in 2016. And those folks are concerned. And they're saying if these tariffs are implemented and if China does retaliate, we're the ones that are going to be hurt. We've got U.S. businesses, some U.S. businesses that are worried about their supply chains being disrupted. And of course, we've even got the American stock market. You know, and Trump always likes to say how the stock market is rising because of him. Not necessarily true, but the reality is, partly because of fears over a possible trade war, that stock market is now turning downwards, and that politically doesn't look good either.
Scott, just one more question to you before I cross over to Deborah and Andrew, because we're just reading now that you were mentioning Kudlow a moment ago, and what he's just said is that China's response to the tariffs has been unsatisfactory. What do you think that means?
Well, I think it means that the line right now that politically is being held is that all of the advisors behind Trump are saying, you know, we're not happy that China announced its tariffs in response to us. They shouldn't have done that. But again, behind the scenes, you've got the fundamental choice, which is the White House has announced tariffs on up to $60 billion of goods, threatening on $100 billion more of that. Now, that's just what they've announced. Implementing those tariffs is a far different matter, especially with the domestic situation we've just discussed. So in private, who wins that battle? The protectionists around Trump, people like Peter Navarro, the Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, or is it those who question whether tariffs are going to hurt the U.S., which is, in private, Larry Kudlow, Steven Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, or do they somehow find some compromise between those two rather different positions?
Andrew Leung, China has formally challenged the U.S.'s tariff decision at the World Trade Organization. What do you make of that response by China? And are we potentially going to see a lengthy legal battle here?
Well, of course, China's main counterattack is that the United States is throwing away all the rules of the WTO. And China has been a staunch supporter of the WTO, from which it benefits. And actually, the first thing that China does is to challenge the American action under the WTO rules. Now, at this stage of the game, I think it's a game of chicken for the time being. So the Trump administration is raising all the stakes against China's retaliatory measures. The Trump administration seems to be doubling down on the demands. But that's just the initial stage of and actually a rivalry, a great power rivalry between the United States and China, not only on a trade front, but of course the economic front. Don't forget the Trump administration specifically targets the Make in China 2025 agenda, which of course encompasses all these 10 big areas where China hopes to dominate the world. So the Americans were saying, well, hey, you know, China is now targeting these areas of dominance, and then if China succeeds, so where is the United States? So in effect, this is more than trade. This is about economic competitiveness. This is about economic dominance. And if you extend if you look at the rivalry in a broader front, it is really a great power rivalry beyond the economic field as well. For example, President Trump is now challenging one of China's main red lines on Taiwan. I mean, the recent release of the recent enactment of the Taiwan Travel Act really touches on the very concept of a one China policy. And then the alliances, military alliances formed with Japan, with Austria, with India, strengthening the China containment policy. So I think that we are at the stage of the game where we're seeing really big power rivalry at play, of which trade is only one of the many manifestations.
And Deborah, President Trump also set his sights on the European Union. He said that barriers in European markets have made it nearly impossible for U.S. companies to do business there. Is this going to escalate now with the European Union? And how much of all of this has to do with this broad pattern of protectionism that Scott was talking about just a moment ago?
Well, I'd like to say that there's a clear strategy that's driving all of this. I think you might be able to sketch out a path of great power rivalry, something like that, you know, sitting here dispassionately and looking at this, you would say, well, that's clearly what's being driven out of the U.S. But I'm not convinced that this particular group has that kind of long-term strategy and focus. I think what is happening are short-term decisions that are being made by a very small group of people, some of whom have the knowledge that they need to make the kind of decisions that they're taking, but many of whom do not have that knowledge. And the challenge that we're facing is that these are micro decisions being taken in the day, the minute, the hour that are adding up to increasing challenges. And so, for example, Trump's complaints about the European Union, I think, came out of essentially nowhere. I don't think he's received any kind of concrete briefing, any kind of assessment that points out to him the ways in which the European Union has somehow blocked American exports. I think that is Trump speaking off the cuff, and suddenly that becomes part of U.S. policy that now is causing scrambles inside of Washington.
Yet even if he's speaking off the cuff, Deborah, apologies for a second,
many
but
of the people are struggling.
even if he is speaking off the cuff, and this is not really a thought-out, longer-term strategy, doesn't what Trump say have the potential to throw the global trading system into a full-on crisis?
Yes, this is the problem with having Donald Trump as president right now in this particular circumstance, especially surrounded with a very small group of people, some of whom are, frankly, dealing in an alternative universe, most notably Peter Navarro, who he relies on quite heavily at the moment for driving policy vis-a-vis China, which is, I think, partly how we've gotten to this particular point where we are unleashing potentially $150 billion in sanctions against China for what is an unclear set of objectives. Again, if the United States had been very clear about what it is that it wanted, it said, we want to go after China for IP violations or for technology transfer, I think the U.S. could have made a very compelling case, could have gotten a coalition of the willing together, could have really brought together some interesting things, could have gotten a nice negotiation together, could have had constructive dialogue with the Chinese. I don't think that's what has happened. And now, instead of having a clear outcome, we have an escalating tit-for-tat retaliation that is potentially spiraling out of control and bringing in the European Union and all of Asia. And this is a quite dangerous situation.
Scott Lucas, I see you nodding along with what Deborah has to say from Singapore. But isn't it fair to say, as Deborah was saying, that the United States does have a legitimate problem with China when it comes to IP? And I'll just put this figure out. The U.S. Trade Representative has said this, that a 7-month long investigation found that Chinese theft of American IP currently costs between $225 billion and $600 billion annually. So isn't Trump right in trying to do something to address this problem, something that the Obama administration wasn't able to do?
Well, I think Deborah said it quite correctly, and that is there is a specific issue here about IP and technology transfer, but there are procedures by which the United States could have brought the case either in direct talks with China or in multilateral discussions involving other countries who are also concerned with these issues. But instead of pursuing that, the Trump administration is using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And the reason why they're using that sledgehammer of sweeping tariffs, let's be honest here, it is not directly about the IP issue, because Deborah's quite right here. That is that certain Trump administration officials who were led initially by the White House chief strategist Steve Bannon from the very outset, said they wanted a confrontation with China. They weren't shy about it. Now, even though Bannon has departed, some of those people who were close to him, like Stephen Miller, then Peter Navarro, have the ear of the president. So this is a political move, in part with all the issues that Andrew pointed out, have to do with influence globally, influence in the Pacific region, where the United States, or at least these advisors, see this as either we win or China wins. Now, when you play that type of zero-sum game, no one wins. And let's be honest here, no one wins. If these tariffs are implemented, then you are going to have an effect on the global economy. And if these tariffs are implemented, ironically, the power that is most able to cope with those tariffs is not the United States, which is far more exposed in terms of its producers and consumers, but it's the Chinese, who are going to be able to respond to that through a centrally planned economy much more effectively than the Americans can if Trump and his people say it's war.
Andrew Leung, on this subject of war, there is an argument that emerged after World War II, in fact, that says that if countries are engaged together in trade, then they are less likely to engage in political or military battles. How much of that is being tested right now, and what do you see as the way forward?
Well, one of the main problems of this kind of confrontation is the frustrations felt by the United States and indeed other Western countries, that all the efforts spent in the past 2 decades trying to bring China into the global norms, as it were, and kind of a rule of law and then a fair trade and all these value systems seem to have failed. Because basically, there is a lack of realization that China is unlike any other Western country. And then China is unlikely to copy the Western kind of norms and value systems, because basically each country is quite different. And in spite of the fact that China is a one-party state, nevertheless, China has succeeded in raising a lot of its people out of poverty and in growing China into the second largest economy in the world. So I think that there is a lack of understanding, a kind of frustration that the West's efforts in trying to make China more like the West has failed.
So what
I think
does
that's
China
point
do
number one.
next?
Point number two, obviously, America is... Well, China, of course, as I said, cannot allow to be coerced by the West once again. We're harking back to the days when China was being invaded, the so-called centuries of humiliation. That is really very, very deep in China's national psyche. And of course, under the very powerful President Xi, China cannot afford to be seen by its people to knuckle under. So China is going to retaliate. China is going to defend its own interests and taking the United States to the WTO. But I think at the end of the game, this is a no-brainer. I think American the top advisors, some of them have written books on trade, and apart from on the trade side, there are other Chinese hawks. For example, John Bolton has been a very hawkish guy. Is now in charge of foreign relations, American foreign policy. So I think that this is also a kind of rivalry between a great power rivalry, seeing China as a potential challenger. And herein lies the danger of the so-called Thucydides trap. And I think both countries realize this. So I think that we are at the beginning of a game of chicken. But I think that both sides realize that at the end of the day, they've got to go back to the negotiating table, either openly or behind the scenes.
All right, we will see what happens. Thank you very much, Deborah Elms from Singapore, Andrew Leung from Hong Kong, and Scott Lucas from Birmingham. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, goodbye for now.